If intelligence leads to answers, why do the smartest people keep asking the biggest question of all? They've built rockets, decoded DNA, and mapped the universe, and yet many of them still whisper a prayer before they sleep. Because maybe the closer you get to understanding everything, the harder it becomes to believe it's all by accident. Introduction. For centuries, we have been told that faith and intelligence live on opposite sides of a line. That belief belongs to the heart and logic to the mind. But history and reality tell a very different story. From Newton to Einstein, from philosophers to neuroscientists, some of the world's brightest thinkers have believed in something beyond reason. This documentary asks the question, why? Why do so many smart minds still believe in God, even in an age ruled by science, data, and artificial intelligence? Over the next hour, we'll explore what logic alone cannot explain: the mystery of consciousness, the design of the universe, the source of morality, and the human need for meaning that no equation can solve. This isn't a sermon. It's a search, a journey through reason, wonder, and the space between. Because maybe belief isn't the opposite of intelligence. Maybe it's the next step. Chapter 1. The Myth of Rational Disbelief. We live in a world that often celebrates reason over faith. In classrooms, laboratories, and headlines, the story seems clear. The smarter we become, the less we need God. It's a simple narrative, almost too simple. Because beneath it lies an unspoken assumption. That belief is born from ignorance and doubt from intelligence. That to believe is to surrender your mind, while to reject belief is to prove you have one. But that story isn't entirely true. In fact, the idea that smart people don't believe in God is one of the most powerful myths of the modern age, a story repeated so often we stopped questioning it. It began centuries ago during the Enlightenment, the age when humanity turned its gaze from heaven to the world itself, to reason, to observation, to science. People started asking questions the church had long avoided. They challenged authority, rejected superstition, and sought proof instead of prayer. And it worked. Science flourished. Technology advanced. The human mind discovered it could understand nature without invoking the divine. But as progress rose, faith began to fall out of favor. Religion was blamed for wars, oppression, and ignorance. Thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot mocked belief as a relic of the past. They imagined a new kind of world, a world ruled entirely by reason, where God was no longer needed to explain anything. And yet, the deeper they went, the more the question remained. Because every time science explained a mystery, a new one appeared behind it, larger, stranger, more impossible to ignore. The universe was no longer a flat stage beneath the heavens. It was infinite, expanding, complex, and precise beyond comprehension. The deeper we looked, the less random it seemed. And suddenly, the line between reason and belief began to blur again. Even the greatest scientists, those who stood at the frontier of human knowledge, found themselves staring into the unknown and whispering, "There must be more." Isaac Newton, who discovered gravity, spent more time writing about God than about math. Blaise Pascal, the brilliant mathematician, spoke of a God-shaped vacuum inside every human heart. Einstein once said, "The more I study science, the more I believe in God." These weren't naive minds clinging to superstition. They were thinkers who faced the limits of logic itself. They saw something that data couldn't capture, a sense of order, beauty, and purpose woven into reality. And so, the myth of rational disbelief began to crack. Because intelligence, it turned out, wasn't the enemy of faith. It was often the path that led to it. But why? Why do some of the world's most brilliant people, after dissecting the universe and decoding life itself, still look beyond it for meaning? To answer that, we need to look deeper, beyond culture, beyond history, beyond religion itself. We need to enter the minds of those who believed, not blindly, but intellectually. Not because they rejected reason, but because they followed it, all the way to the edge. And when reason reached its limit, that's where belief began. Next, we step into the lives of history's greatest thinkers. Scientists, philosophers, and innovators whose brilliance didn't erase faith, but deepened it. Chapter 2. The Minds of Faith. Giants who believed. For centuries, the story of progress has been told as a battle between faith versus reason, church versus science, the believer versus the thinker. But that's not how the people who actually built our understanding of the world saw it. The truth is, many of the giants of science, the very minds who gave birth to modern knowledge, were driven not by the rejection of God, but by the pursuit of Him. Isaac Newton was one of them. To him, studying the universe was an act of devotion, a way to read the handwriting of God across the fabric of creation. He once wrote, "Gravity explains the motions of the planets, but it cannot explain who sets the planets in motion." For Newton, the more he uncovered about the cosmos, the more he saw purpose written into its design. And he wasn't alone. Johannes Kepler, who revealed the laws of planetary motion, described his work as thinking God's thoughts after him. For Kepler, every orbit, every number, every symmetry was a glimpse into divine geometry, the language of the Creator written in stars. Then came Blaise Pascal, philosopher, mathematician, physicist, a man who mastered logic, but whose intellect led him to something deeper. He famously said, "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know." To Pascal, faith wasn't blindness. It was the recognition that logic alone could not explain existence. It could not measure love, morality, or purpose, the things that make us human. Centuries later, Albert Einstein carried that same wonder into the modern world. He didn't believe in a personal God, not in the traditional sense, but he saw something spiritual in the order of the universe. He spoke of a cosmic religious feeling, a reverence for the mystery behind all laws. He said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." To Einstein, the very fact that our minds could understand reality was miraculous, a sign that consciousness itself might be connected to something greater. These were not preachers or prophets, they were scientists. They built telescopes, not temples. But when they looked through those telescopes, what they saw was not chaos, but coherence. The deeper they went, the more they sensed that intelligence was not alone in the universe. That reason might be the language of something higher, not the proof that there is nothing higher. Even today, that same pattern continues. Francis Collins, the geneticist who led the Human Genome Project, the man who mapped the code of life itself, is a Christian. He once said, "When you see the amazing complexity of the human genome, you cannot help but feel awe, a sense that humanity is not an accident." In his eyes, decoding DNA was like reading the ancient script of creation, the words through which existence was spoken into being. And that's what unites these brilliant minds across time, a shared recognition that reason doesn't destroy mystery. It illuminates it. For them, science and faith were not enemies. They were two lenses looking at the same reality, one revealing the how, the other asked why. And in that space between how and why, between fact and meaning, they found wonder. So maybe belief was never about closing your mind, but about keeping it open to what reason alone cannot reach. Maybe the greatest thinkers believed, not because they lacked evidence, but because they saw too much of it. But there's another side to this story, one that challenges even the believers. Because for every Newton or Pascal, there were others who looked at the universe and saw only emptiness. No order, no purpose, just random laws playing themselves out. So who was right? Can faith and logic truly coexist? Or are they destined to collide? To answer that, we must look deeper into the heart of knowledge itself, into the limits of reason and the questions that no equation can answer. Chapter 3. The Limits of Logic. For centuries, human reason has been our most powerful tool. It split the atom, mapped the genome, and reached the stars. We learned to question everything, even ourselves. And yet, for all that progress, the reason still stops somewhere. Because logic can tell us how the universe works, but it cannot tell us why it exists at all. Science can measure, calculate, and predict, but the moment it asks, "What does it mean?" it falls silent. There's an old saying, the more we know, the more we realize how much we don't. It's not ignorance that creates mystery, it's understanding. Because every discovery opens new doors to deeper questions. We learned what atoms are made of, and then asked, why do they exist in the first place? We discovered DNA, and then wondered, who wrote the code? We mapped the brain, only to find we still don't understand the mind. At the edge of knowledge, logic meets its own horizon, and beyond that horizon lies faith. Not blind belief, but the quiet acknowledgement that there are truths beyond what we can prove. Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest minds in history, believed that reason could only go so far. He said, "I had to limit knowledge to make room for faith." He understood that logic is a closed loop. It explains what's within the system, but never how the system itself came to be. So when reason hits a wall, some walk away in disbelief. But others, the ones this documentary is about, look at that wall and see a doorway. They understand something profound, that the human mind, no matter how brilliant, didn't design itself. It's part of something larger, a mystery that can be studied but never fully solved. Think about this. Every law of physics, every number, every constant that holds reality together, depends on something we can't explain. Gravity works, but why does it exist at all? Time flows forward, but why? Light travels at a fixed speed, but who set that number? We can measure the rules. We can describe them beautifully. But the origin of those rules, their existence, remains untouched by reason. The deeper science digs into the how, the more it uncovers the mystery of the why. And that's where intelligence meets humility, because for many great thinkers, faith doesn't begin where logic ends. It grows out of the realization that logic alone isn't enough. Take the human experience. Logic can't measure love. It can't quantify awe, or purpose, or beauty. It can describe the chemical reactions in your brain when you see a sunset, but it can't explain why it moves you to tears. Those are not irrational things. They are deeply human, and perhaps deeply divine. Because intelligence without meaning becomes machinery. Knowledge without wonder becomes empty. And so, the question returns. What if belief isn't a rejection of reason, but a recognition of its limits? What if the smartest minds throughout history didn't believe despite logic, but because they followed it so far, they saw it had an end? And at that end, they found something reason couldn't erase, the mystery of consciousness, the strange, undeniable awareness of being. Why do we think? Why do we feel? Why do we know that we exist at all? No formula, no equation, no neuron map has ever answered that. Because consciousness isn't just data. It's the experience of reality itself. And maybe that's where the real evidence for belief begins. In the next chapter, we'll step into that mystery, the enigma that even the brightest minds can't solve. Because before we can understand God, we must first understand ourselves, the mind that searches, and the soul that wonders. Chapter 4. Consciousness, the unsolved enigma. Everything you've ever known, every sight, sound, thought, or dream, has only existed inside one place, your mind. The mind, that invisible space where reality unfolds. It has no shape, no color, no weight, and yet it holds the entire universe. We can measure the brain, but no one truly understands consciousness. We know the electrical signals. We can see neurons firing, chemicals flowing, circuits lighting up. But the feeling, the awareness of being alive, remains a mystery no microscope can capture. Philosophers call it the hard problem of consciousness. How does matter, lifeless atoms and empty space, suddenly become aware? How does a brain, made of dust and carbon, create a universe of thoughts, emotions, and dreams? Science can describe what happens when we think, but it cannot explain why thinking happens at all. And that's where even the most brilliant scientists pause. Because consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it creates the experience of it. Without awareness, the universe might still exist, but it would be silent, empty, unseen. So here's the question that terrifies logic. If the universe exists only through awareness, does that mean consciousness is more fundamental than matter? Some of the greatest minds in history have wrestled with this. René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." He realized that even if everything could be doubted, the world, the senses, even logic, one thing could not, the existence of the conscious self that was doing the doubting. That idea, that consciousness is the foundation of all knowing, still echoes today. In modern neuroscience and quantum physics, there are whispers of the same thought. That consciousness may not come from the universe, but might be woven into it. What if awareness is not an accident of biology, but the signature of something eternal? Take quantum mechanics, the strange, subatomic world where nothing behaves as it should. Particles exist in many states at once until they are observed. The act of measurement, of awareness, collapses reality into form. It's as if the universe waits to be noticed before it decides what to become. Many scientists avoid the spiritual implications of this, but others, like Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner, dared to ask, is consciousness fundamental to reality itself? He wasn't preaching, he was observing that at the deepest level, the universe and the mind seem mysteriously linked, as if the act of knowing is part of the fabric of existence. It's here, in the question of consciousness, that faith and science begin to look at each other again. Because belief, at its core, is consciousness reaching beyond itself, asking not only what is true, but why does truth matter? And for intelligent believers, this mystery is not proof of ignorance, it's proof of depth. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, once called consciousness an astonishing hypothesis. Others, like physicist David Chalmers, say it's not a hypothesis at all. It's the very ground of experience. And yet, for every theory, the mystery only grows. Maybe that's the point. Maybe consciousness is the mirror through which we see the divine. Because when you look inward, when you ask, "Who am I?" you are asking the oldest spiritual question in history. From ancient mystics to modern neuroscientists, the same riddle remains. What is the self that observes the world? Is it neurons or something beyond them? No scan, no formula, no algorithm has ever found it. But every human being feels it. That inner light of awareness, silent, personal, and yet universal. And maybe, just maybe, that's where faith begins. Not as a rejection of knowledge, but as an acknowledgement that being itself is a miracle. That there's something within us that science can't dissect, and yet it defines who we are. If the mind is a mystery that points to something greater, then the universe it observes might be too. Because the more consciousness looks outward, the more it discovers a cosmos that seems built for conscious beings to exist at all, which leads to a question as vast as creation itself. Why does the universe seem perfectly tuned for life, and for minds like ours? To find that answer, we'll look beyond the brain, beyond the self, to the stars themselves. Chapter 5. The Universe That Knows We're Here. Look up at the night sky. Every star you see, and the billions you don't, obeys laws that never break. Gravity, light, time, energy, all balanced with mathematical precision. If any of these laws were just slightly different, you wouldn't be here to notice them. Change one constant, just one, and the universe collapses. If gravity were a fraction stronger, the cosmos would have imploded. If it were weaker, stars would never have formed. If the expansion of space had been off by 1 part in a trillion, there would be no galaxies, no planets, no life. The entire universe, from the birth of light to the beating of your heart, depends on an impossible balance. So impossible, in fact, that some scientists began to whisper the words that make reason tremble. It almost looks designed. This is called the fine-tuning problem, one of the most astonishing discoveries of modern physics. The more we study the universe, the more we realize how fragile its conditions truly are. Roger Penrose, one of the greatest mathematical physicists alive, calculated the odds of our universe existing as it does. The number he found was so small, it defies imagination, like hitting a single atom out of all particles in the known cosmos by chance. And yet, here we are, a universe tuned perfectly not only for life, but for minds capable of understanding it. It's what scientists call the anthropic principle, the strange fact that the universe seems to know we rehere, that its laws are not only suited for existence, but for awareness, as if reality itself wanted to be observed. Some interpret this as pure coincidence. Others, like the late physicist Freeman Dyson, saw something more. He said, "The universe, in some sense, knew we were coming." Even Stephen Hawking, often cited as a skeptic, admitted, "The laws of science, as we know them, contain many precisely adjusted constants, so finely tuned that they appear to have been designed." But if the universe looks designed, does that mean there's a designer? That's where faith and science part ways, but only by a thread. Because for some thinkers, the language of physics begins to sound like theology. Equations that describe creation mirror ancient metaphors of divine order. The Big Bang, the moment everything came from nothing, echoes words spoken thousands of years ago. Let there be light. Of course, science doesn't prove God, but it does raise a question that reason can't silence. Why does the universe exist in such a way that consciousness, fragile, fleeting, human consciousness, can stand here and ask why? For some, that question leads to randomness. For others, it leads to revelation. Einstein called it the cosmic religious feeling, that sense of awe when we realize that the universe didn't have to be beautiful, but it is. Every law, every pattern, every constant reflects a kind of elegance that mathematics alone can't explain. It feels deliberate, like art. And perhaps that's what faith really is. Not a denial of reason, but a recognition of beauty so vast that reason itself bows before it. Because intelligence can measure the stars, but only wonder can make us feel their meaning. Even today, some of the world's top physicists speak in near-spiritual language. Paul Davies, an astrophysicist, wrote, "The impression of design is overwhelming." And Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, once said, "Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, because we ourselves are part of the mystery." That's the turning point, when science realizes that it's not outside the story, but inside it. Because the same atoms that make stars make you. The same laws that hold galaxies together hold your heartbeat steady. And when intelligent people see that, when they look at the cosmic scale and realize that life and thought were somehow written into the equation, belief becomes more than a superstition. It becomes a response to wonder. So perhaps the question isn't whether the universe was made for us. Perhaps it's whether we were made to see it, to search, to ask, to recognize something sacred in its order. Because when you stare long enough into the universe, you start to feel it staring back. And that's where the story of belief deepens. Not in the stars above, but in what those stars awaken within us. The longing for meaning, the hunger for purpose, the sense that morality, right and wrong, good and evil, must come from somewhere beyond survival. To understand that part of the mystery, we have to look inward again. Not into the brain this time, but into the heart. Chapter 6, Morality and Meaning Beyond Equations. We have explored the vastness of the universe, its laws, its precision, its almost impossible balance. But now, let's turn to something even more mysterious, something we can't see through a telescope or measure in a lab. Right and wrong, good and evil. Love, justice, mercy, the invisible forces that shape our lives more deeply than gravity ever could. Where do they come from? Science can explain how we behave. It can map the parts of the brain that light up when we feel compassion or guilt. It can trace moral instincts back to evolution, to survive, to cooperate. But what it cannot explain is why we should care. Why do we feel guilty at all? Why do we sacrifice for others? Why love feels sacred and cruelty feels wrong? Evolution might teach us how morality helps a species survive, but it cannot explain why a soldier throws himself on a grenade or why a stranger risks everything for someone they'll never meet. Those moments, the ones that defy logic, are what make us human, and they hint at something beyond nature's equations. Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries. If morality is just an illusion, a trick of the brain or a product of culture, then what does good even mean? Is kindness just chemistry? Is justice just preference? If there's no higher standard, then every moral claim is just opinion, no different than taste in music. But deep down, none of us live that way. We all believe some things are truly right, and others are truly wrong. Slavery, torture, betrayal, genocide. Theses aren't just social disagreements. They are moral realities that transcend time and culture. And if morality is real, not invented but discovered, then it must come from somewhere. Immanuel Kant called this the moral law within. He said the same wonder that fills us when we look at the stars is mirrored in the conscience inside us. Two infinities, one above, one within. Kant believed morality pointed toward a higher order, toward purpose, design, and meaning. To him, the existence of moral law implied a moral lawgiver. It wasn't proof in the mathematical sense, but it was evidence in the human sense. Because every time you feel compassion, every time you choose right over wrong when no one is watching, you're acting as if your life has meaning. And meaning, by definition, cannot exist in a meaningless universe. Thinkers like Dostoevsky warned that, without God, everything is permitted. He didn't mean people without faith can't be moral. He meant that without something sacred above human opinion, nothing can truly be wrong. History has shown it. When humans try to build morality without a higher anchor, the results are fragile. Systems collapse, truth bends, and eventually, power defines what's right. That is why even the most rational societies end up searching for a moral compass they didn't invent. So perhaps the moral sense inside us, the pull toward goodness, isn't a leftover from evolution, but a reflection of something eternal. Because every time we feel empathy, every time we forgive instead of hate, we act against the logic of survival. We transcend it. Maybe that's the divine signature written into our DNA, the spark that makes us more than flesh, more than instinct, more than matter. Even the great skeptics acknowledged this mystery. Albert Camus, the existentialist, rejected God, yet admitted that living without meaning was unbearable. He wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." He couldn't find purpose in reason, but he couldn't stop searching for it either. That longing, that ache for something beyond survival, is the fingerprint of faith. Not the kind built on dogma, but the quiet faith that morality, meaning, and love must have a source deeper than chance. So perhaps the real question isn't whether God is logical, but whether life without him is. Because without meaning, intelligence becomes calculation. Without purpose, knowledge becomes noise. And without goodness, reason becomes power, cold, efficient, and empty. The smartest minds in history understood that balance. That logic builds the world, but morality gives it a soul. And maybe that's why so many intelligent people still believe, because faith doesn't contradict reason, it completes it. But there's one more piece of this puzzle. Because even with morality and meaning, the mystery deepens. Some scientists and philosophers now believe that consciousness itself, that awareness we explored earlier, is tied to something deeper than the material world. A field of mind, energy, and observation that connects everything. It's the frontier where physics meets philosophy, and maybe where science meets spirit. Chapter 7. The Quantum Mind and the Mystery of Reality. We've explored the vastness of the universe and the depth of the human mind. But now we arrive at the borderland between both, a place where science itself begins to sound like poetry. Quantum physics. The strangest, most puzzling discovery in all of human knowledge. Because at the smallest scale of reality, everything we thought we knew about the universe stops making sense. Inside the quantum world, matter behaves in ways that defy logic. A single particle can be in two places at once. An electron can spin in opposite directions at the same time. A photon can pass through two slits simultaneously until someone looks. And that's the most mysterious part. The act of observation changes what is observed. Before it's measured, a particle exists in a blur of possibilities. When we look, it becomes one, as if awareness itself decides what reality will be. This is the observer effect, one of the most baffling findings in physics. And for some of the greatest scientific minds, it suggested something deeply unsettling. That consciousness and the cosmos might be intertwined. Physicist Eugene Wigner once said, "It was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness." In other words, you can't separate the mind from the matter it observes. Reality, it seems, is not something that simply exists. It's something that happens between the universe and the observer. This doesn't mean science proves God, but it does challenge the old materialist story, the idea that everything is just atoms colliding in the dark. Because at the quantum level, the universe is not a machine. It's a mystery of relationships, probabilities, and perception. Matter isn't solid. It's vibrations, energy, information. It doesn't even exist in a definite form until it's experienced. And that raises a question few dare to ask aloud. What if consciousness isn't a product of matter but the foundation of it? Across centuries, philosophers and mystics have said the same thing in different languages. That the universe is not just physical, it's also mental. That mind is woven into matter. That spirit is not separate from the world, but hidden within it. Even Erwin Schrödinger, who gave us the famous thought experiment of the cat, believed that consciousness was one, a single universal field expressing itself through countless individual minds. He wrote, "The total number of minds in the universe is one." To him, life wasn't an accident. It was the universe becoming aware of itself. And if the universe can think, then maybe belief in something greater isn't irrational. Maybe it's natural. This view, once dismissed as mystical, is quietly returning to modern science. Physicists, philosophers, even AI researchers are beginning to wonder if consciousness is fundamental. If the universe is, at its core, an intelligent system. Not intelligent like a human being, but purposeful, self-organizing, aware, connected. Some call it panpsychism. Others call it the mind of God. Either way, it's the same intuition that has haunted humanity since the beginning. That behind everything visible there is something thinking, something knowing, something alive. So perhaps the boundaries between science and faith were never meant to be walls. Perhaps they're mirrors, each reflecting the same truth from opposite sides. Because quantum physics doesn't destroy wonder, it deepens it. It reminds us that certainty is an illusion, and that the fabric of reality is far stranger than any dogma, religious or scientific, ever imagined. And maybe that's why the most intelligent people keep believing. Because the closer they get to the truth, the more they sense that truth has a mind of its own. Everything connects. The mind that observes, the world it observes, and the moral meaning that binds them together. Faith, then, isn't a leap away from knowledge. It's a step toward the mystery that knowledge reveals. And that mystery doesn't just exist in theory or physics. It's alive in the human experience of courage, love, and awe. Because faith, in the end, is not about escaping reason. It's about embracing wonder. And for some, that wonder leads them to believe that intelligence itself might be sacred. But if belief can be intelligent, what does that say about the act of believing itself? Is faith an escape from reason, or an act of intellectual courage? Chapter 8. Faith as Intellectual Courage. Every discovery begins with a question. Every act of knowledge starts with a step into the unknown, guided only by curiosity and courage. Science calls it a hypothesis. Faith calls it trust. Both are acts of belief. Because every search for truth, whether in a lab or in a prayer, begins with the same words. I don't know, but I'm willing to find out. For centuries, faith has been painted as the enemy of reason, a refuge for the fearful, the uneducated, the naive. But history tells a very different story. The greatest leaps in human understanding, from the birth of modern science to the moral revolutions that shaped civilization, were made by people who refused to separate knowledge from meaning. They believed that truth was worth pursuing, even when it shattered their certainty. Faith, at its core, isn't blind acceptance. It's courage. The courage to stand before mystery and say, there is more here than I can prove. Think of Galileo. He believed in both science and spirit, in a universe that was vast and divine. He faced persecution not because he rejected faith, but because he believed truth itself was sacred. Or Newton, who saw no contradiction between discovering gravity and believing in a creator. For him, science was not rebellion against God. It was worship through understanding. These minds weren't choosing between reason and belief. They were using reason to explore belief. Because to have faith is not to stop thinking. It's to keep thinking, even when the answers aren't clear. Faith, in this sense, is not about superstition. It's about humility. The willingness to admit that human intelligence, no matter how vast, cannot contain the totality of truth. In a world that prizes control and certainty, faith demands something radical: surrender. Not the surrender of logic, but the surrender of pride, the acceptance that the universe might be greater than our capacity to explain it. And that takes a different kind of intelligence, one that blends reason with reverence. Because arrogance says, I understand everything. Faith says, I am still learning. In our modern age, we often mistake doubt for weakness. But the truth is, doubt is part of faith. Its shadow, its test, its proof of sincerity. To question is not to betray belief, it's to refine it. Some of the most intelligent believers didn't cling to certainty, they wrestled with it. C.S. Lewis, once an atheist, called faith the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. He understood that intellect alone can't sustain meaning, that life's deepest questions demand both thought and trust. Because reason builds the bridge, but faith is what makes you walk across it. When people say faith and reason are opposites, they forget that both are human responses to mystery. Science explores the visible. Faith explores the invisible. One studies the universe. The other asks why there is a universe at all. They are not enemies. They are partners in the search for truth. One without the other becomes hollow. Reason without faith loses wonder. Faith without reason loses direction. Together, they form something powerful, an intelligence that is both analytical and awestruck. That's why so many great minds throughout history kept believing, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They saw faith not as a retreat from knowledge, but as its highest expression. To them, believing in God wasn't rejecting the unknown, it was embracing it. Because the ultimate act of intelligence isn't to conquer mystery, it's to stand before it and listen. When we do that, faith becomes something far more profound, not the end of thinking, but the beginning of understanding. Faith as intellectual courage means we keep searching, even when the answers dissolve into silence. It means accepting that reality is bigger than proof and truth deeper than evidence, and that maybe the heart and the mind were never meant to compete, but to complete each other. In every age, those who believed intelligently changed the world, not because they had all the answers, but because they refused to stop asking the questions that matter most. And as science reaches deeper into the structure of existence, those same questions return. Who are we? Why are we here? And what is this universe trying to tell us? Perhaps that's why, even in our age of logic and algorithms, faith still survives. Because it speaks to the part of us that reason alone cannot fill. But what happens when the modern world, with all its intellect and technology, tries to live without that faith? What does a civilization built only on reason become? And can it find its way back to wonder? Chapter 9. The Modern Mind and the Return to God. We live in the most advanced age in human history. Our technology is miraculous. We carry the world in our pockets. We can measure time, matter, and space with unimaginable precision. We've learned to manipulate life itself. But for all our intelligence, something feels missing. We know more than ever, and yet we understand less and less what it all means. Modern humanity has gained the power of gods and lost the sense of why gods ever mattered. We've replaced mystery with data, faith with algorithms, community with connection, and still, the same quiet ache remains. We've conquered disease, distance, and death itself in some forms, yet anxiety, loneliness, and despair are higher than they've ever been. Because knowledge expands the mind, but it doesn't always heal the heart. Somewhere in our pursuit of progress, we traded meaning for mastery. We stopped asking why and focused only on how, but the why doesn't disappear. It hides beneath the noise. It surfaces in quiet moments, in grief, in beauty, in love, in the silence between thoughts. Even in a world that claims to have outgrown God, the human heart still kneels, before wonder, before loss. The modern mind was supposed to outsmart belief. But something unexpected is happening. Faith, or something like it, is returning. Not the blind faith of old dogmas, but a deeper, humbler kind. Scientists, philosophers, and technologists, people who once dismissed spirituality as illusion, are beginning to look again. Some find it in the laws of physics, others in the mystery of consciousness, and some in the fragile beauty of existence itself. They're realizing that rationality alone cannot sustain meaning. That intelligence without transcendence becomes exhaustion, a mind that knows everything but believes in nothing. The philosopher Charles Taylor called it the secular age, an age where we've built a world without the sacred, and discovered how heavy that world feels. Because when everything is explainable, nothing feels extraordinary. When the soul becomes a chemical reaction, love loses its fire. When morality becomes relative, truth loses its gravity. And so the pendulum begins to swing back from disbelief to rediscovery. Today, some of the brightest minds are quietly rebuilding bridges between logic and faith. Neuroscientists exploring consciousness, astrophysicists studying fine-tuning, philosophers questioning materialism. Even AI researchers ask whether machines can ever understand the soul. They're not preaching, they're wondering. Because the more they uncover, the more they see that pure reason doesn't complete the picture. It leaves a blank space where meaning should be. And that blank space is calling us back. Back to awe. Back to purpose. Back to something sacred, not imposed from outside, but rediscovered within. It's not the return of religion as an institution. It's the return of wonder as truth. Faith, for the modern mind, is no longer about fear or tradition. It's about coherence, the search for a world that makes emotional and moral sense, not just mathematical sense. Because logic tells us how the heart beats, but faith reminds us why it beats at all. Maybe the modern mind hasn't outgrown God. Maybe it's finally beginning to understand Him, not as a superstition to control, but as the mystery that gives reason its meaning. All across the world, something quiet is happening. People who were raised on logic and skepticism are turning back toward the transcendent. They meditate, they pray, they search. Not because they've stopped thinking, but because they've started feeling again. The soul, it seems, was never defeated by science. It was simply waiting to be noticed again. And in that rediscovery, in that return to wonder, lies the future of intelligence itself. Because maybe the next stage of human evolution isn't technological. Maybe it's spiritual. Not a rejection of progress, but its fulfillment. Where knowledge serves wisdom, where reason walks hand in hand with reverence, where understanding leads not to arrogance, but to awe. Because the smartest mind is not the one that knows the most, but the one that remembers to wonder. And so, after centuries of trying to separate logic from faith, the modern world stands where it began, at the edge of mystery. The question is no longer whether belief is rational, it's whether reason alone can satisfy the human spirit. Chapter 10. The Light Beyond Logic. For centuries, we've been told that intelligence and faith are rivals, that one seeks proof and the other comfort. But after all our searching, after all our knowledge and progress, we find ourselves standing in the same ancient silence, still asking the same eternal question: why are we here? Because in the end, logic explains the world, but it cannot explain us. It can describe the motion of the stars, but not the ache of the heart. It can measure time, but not the meaning of a moment. It can define life, but not what makes it worth living. Reason gives us knowledge, but belief gives that knowledge direction. The story of humanity has never been a war between mind and spirit. It's been a conversation, a dialogue between what we can prove and what we can only feel. And maybe that's why the most intelligent people throughout history didn't lose their faith when they discovered the truth. They deepened it. Because the more they saw of the universe, the more they saw how little of it they truly understood. And instead of despairing, they chose wonder. Faith, to them, was not the end of thought. It was its highest form. We've seen it again and again. In Newton, who saw divine order in the laws of motion. In Pascal, who found the limits of reason and the reasons of the heart. Einstein, who spoke of a cosmic religious feeling. In countless thinkers today who stare into the quantum fabric of reality and sense something alive, something intentional, behind it all. They believed not because they feared ignorance, but because they had the courage to face it. Because beyond all that logic could prove, they still felt the whisper of something infinite, a quiet intelligence behind existence itself. Maybe that whisper is what we call God. Not a name, not a rule, not an institution, but the pulse that moves through everything, the mind that thinks within every thought, the presence that turns chaos into cosmos, the light that reason can't create, but can learn to see. And maybe that's what faith really is, not the denial of science, but the awakening of awe. Because intelligence without wonder becomes arrogance, and wonder without intelligence becomes superstition. But together, they become wise. We live in an age of machines, data, and endless knowledge, but knowledge alone will never teach us how to live. We can build rockets to reach the stars, but we still need meaning to know why we're reaching. And that's where faith belongs, not as a rival to reason, but as its compass. It reminds us that our intelligence has a purpose, our morality has a source, and our existence has a story. So why do smart minds still believe in God? Because they've seen enough of the world to know that its order isn't random. Because they've searched long enough to find that meaning isn't an illusion. Because they've realized that truth is not just a formula, it's a flame. Faith doesn't begin where reason ends. It begins where reason opens its hands and says, I have seen so much, and still I do not understand. In the end, faith is not ignorance. It's courage. The courage to live in mystery without despair, to hope when logic runs out, to love when reason says not to believe that existence itself is not an accident, but a gift. Because the light we seek beyond logic might be the very reason logic exists at all. And so, as the story continues, as science reaches farther and thought grows deeper, perhaps the greatest discovery still waiting ahead isn't it out there among the stars, but within the soul that dares to wonder. Because intelligence may reveal how the universe works, but only faith reminds us why it's worth knowing. If this journey spoke to you, if it reminded you that faith and reason were never enemies, share it. Let's bring back the conversation the world forgot. Not between science and religion, but between knowledge and wonder. Subscribe for the next chapter of Logic Over Spirit, where we continue to explore the mysteries that connect mind, meaning, and the divine. Thank you for watching.